I'm very happy to be here today with Lou Wolf. He's one of the founders of Covert Action Information Bulletin. CAIB, as it was also known, was a seminal alternative media magazine. It was famous for covering and countering CIA covert actions across the globe. It was originally published between 1978 and 2005, both as Covert Action Information Bulletin and Covert Action Quarterly, and is about to be relaunched online as Covert Action Magazine at covertactionmagazine.com. So thank you, Lou, very much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate it, and this is very exciting, I think.
Thank you, Dave, so much. It's my privilege and honor. Thank you.
Before we get into the history of Covert Action Magazine, will you tell us about the relaunch? Who's involved? What's the hopes for it this time around, and what are your plans for it?
Absolutely. It's actually, you put in the future tense. Actually, we have now relaunched the magazine after a lapse of some 13 years since 2005 until today. That was necessitated by the fact that my first wife was dying of kidney cancer, and then I lost my leg to amputation quite suddenly, and so we had to put it on hold. But even at that time, we envisioned possibly coming back, returning to publication, and that's exactly what we're doing today. One of our co-founders is the son of Philip Agee, Christopher Agee, an extraordinary man, a professor in New York who teaches now 11 courses as an adjunct professor, low with starvation pay, which he gets, and but he is a master of, just like his father, of understanding what all this is about, and I consider him I'm an apostle of Chris Agee, like his father. Then the other people that are organizing this are Emmanuel Ness, who's a professor, also Mike Locker, who's one of the founders of North American Congress of Latin America, Mark Cook, another professor and academic and a researcher, Josh Klein, who's a professor. I'm sorry I'm unable to give you the details right now because I'm sitting in a chair and I didn't write it down ahead. But
No, of course. What's
all very qualified people. And Sam Alcoff, who's one of the co-founders of Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. Then we have some other folks as well on board. So it's a growing. We now have a advisory board of several, almost 17 people now. So we're making it a very serious effort. This is not a hobby or a part-time issue for us. It's a full-time project which will necessitate serious attention to detail, to historic detail, to academic detail, and to facts. Not what the clown in the White House talks about, fake news. This is the real story, and that's what we're going to do. Thank you.
No, very good. Am I right? You guys you're going to publish online at covertactionmagazine.com, and then you're going to put out one issue a year for subscribers. Is that correct, right?
That's correct. Actually, this is our 40th anniversary in 2018. We started in 1978, so our effort and our vision is to have a 40th anniversary print issue. But we're already, if you go to our website, there are articles up there, we're interviews and breaking news and so forth, which is not likely to find its way into the mainstream media. And it's not only about better known things, about the lesser known, the hidden history, like is so wonderfully represented in your publication or in your website, Dave. And most of the history of these kinds of operations are hidden from sight. Obviously, when we talk about the CIA, we talk about all manner of operations which actually beg your disbelief in knowing what they will do. I mean, it never ceases to amaze us who study these issues and study that particular agency and its allied agencies as well, what they will stoop to, what they will conceive of, what they will raise as their objectives and as their priorities. And it's no exaggeration. Over the years, we've highlighted a whole range of different aspects of these things, but I want to stress here, it's not just the CIA. The CIA works in alliance with other agencies of this government, has done so since its inception, since its founding in 1947, which, of course, chief among them includes the Pentagon, but also includes other agencies such as the U.S. Information Agency or USIA, includes AID, the Agency for International Development, and includes a whole host of not just contractors, but so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And they are among the most, the NGOs are among the most vigorous advocates of these kinds of operations.
And when you refer to those, are you talking about the National Endowment for Democracy?
Well, NED, which I always have said is the most misnamed agency or organization that you can imagine. To call something the National Endowment for Democracy, when you go to even their own website or to their national reports, their yearly annual reports, it's like a roadmap to what the CIA is doing without it being officially the CIA. In fact, the founder of the NED was once quoted in the Washington Post, well, we do today what the CIA was not allowed to do, was outlawed from doing before. We do it publicly. Mm. And he was proud of that, and he never denied saying that. And NED, my gosh, if I invite your listeners to know better what NED is doing, and they're involved in over 75 countries, both allies and enemies of the United States, in destabilization, in throwing election or being involved in elections, and in some cases throwing those elections, as they did in Nicaragua, as they have tried recently again to do in Venezuela, and as they've done in many other places. But the fact is that what NED does is a cross-government operation, and they get their funding from Congress, and it's a massive operation, one which people have to understand is intricately involved in covert activities as well.
Mm. Well, let's go back and look to 1978 and even a little before, when you guys began. I wonder if you can, before we even talk about the magazine itself, can you give us a feel of the mood of the late 70s when, in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate and things like the Church Committee, where there was kind of dissent, not just on the streets, there was even dissent inside the halls of Congress and the Senate to some degree. Do you feel that feeling, in a sense, gave birth to something like Covert Action? And then from there, how did you guys, who were the founders, and how did you guys all come to find each other and decide to do this huge project that turned into a, multi-decade magazine like that?
Well, Dave, it's beautiful to look back as I'm trying to do here 40 years later, to understand that we were inspired by the extraordinary example of Philip Agee when he became one, though not the only first whistleblower against the CIA, but one of them. When he had just spent 12 years in Latin America, in Uruguay and Brazil and Ecuador. And he acknowledged publicly that, and in his books, on company business, and two later books, On the Run, and the other one I'm blanking right now. And so he acknowledged that he really woke up when he was sitting in the office of the police chief in Montevideo, Uruguay, and he said, I heard this screaming going on, a man's voice, and he was screaming, obviously in pain. And so he asked, hey, Jefe, the police chief, Jefe, what's going on? He said, Philip, he said, the chief said, don't you remember you turned him over to us last week? And suddenly this wave of horrible feeling came over Phil, and he realized that, yes, he was directly implicated in that man behind that wall being tortured at that moment. And he said that was the moment, although he had been thinking of quitting the CIA before that, but quitting the CIA is not an easy thing to do. And he realized at that point in time he had to work on actively to plan his exit from the CIA. Then two other people, we co-founders with us, was Jim and Elsie Wilcott. Jim and Elsie were in the CIA. Elsie was a secretary and Jim was a finance officer. And Jim's job was to sit in a cage and dole out currencies of dozens of different countries. And he told us that, in fact, with some of those currencies were, in fact, were actually counterfeited by the CIA. So they were actually counterfeiting currencies of different countries in order to destabilize the economies in those countries. So he was sitting in his cage, and it was a very threatening and scary job because you're surrounded by some pretty scary and demented and believing people working for the CIA, operations officers. And one day he used to go up in a Piper Cub because that was his release, that was his recreation. So he'd fly. This was when he and Elsie were based in Japan, so he went up up in the plane, was flying around. All of a sudden, he gets an urgent message from the base, which in fact was a U.S. military base in Tokyo. Unlike in most places in Tokyo at that time, the embassy was not a part of the CIA or was not a direct base for the CIA. And so he got this message: return to base immediately. So he landed the plane, walked into the station, as it's called, the CIA station, and there was a big party going on. He said, hey, what's going on here? There was champagne bottles popping and people dancing and a lot of hoopla and toasting champagne and everything. And he said, what's going on? Nobody told me there was a party. Oh, Jim, didn't you know? And they leaned down and turned on Armed Forces TV. Kennedy had just been shot, and they were celebrating.
Wow.
And he testified to this before the Senate committee under oath that had happened. And in fact, he even gave the name of a very high-ranking CIA man who was identified in one of our books as coming up to his cage one day, where he gave out all this money. And Jim was still in shock about the assassination. And the guy says, what's wrong? Hey, Jim, why are you so down? What's going on? And Jim said, I still can't believe our president is dead. Oh, Jim, don't you remember giving money for the Oswald project out of that cage? I did what? He said. And so that's part of the story. Jim and Elsie Wilcott co-founded with us. And then Ellen Ray and Bill Schaap. Ellen had worked as a researcher with the DA in New Orleans and in the assassination of Kennedy. investigation. And then Bill Schaap was a military defense lawyer for GIs, so helping people in that regard, helping GIs get justice out of coming back from Vietnam and other wars as well. So that was the group that founded the magazine, and then we went on to integrate other people, writers from all over the country and all over the world. Actually, in the span of our 27 years from 1978 to 2005, I've counted we had over 280 different authors who wrote for us during that time. We are now hoping that we can include a number of them, those who are still living. Unfortunately, a number of them have passed in the interim. And it's very sad for me to realize that I'm the only co-founder still living, and the others, Michael Ratner, the co-founder of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Bill Kunstler, the great international lawyer, who was one of the most amazing people we ever knew. He was also a comedian, so he managed to mix comedy into the life that he was trying to live and defending people. So that's sort of the beginning.
Well, it's an incredible list of people and an incredible history to it. Do you want to talk about some of the early work you did? I definitely would like you to tell the story of the law that eventually was passed to sort of stymie your work by the Congress. So do you want to talk about some of what you were doing to counter some of the CIA operations, and then how that law came to affect you?
Well, one of the things we realized very early on, back in 1978, was that the people that do the CIA's dirty work, most times, not every time, but most times, they're working undercover in what is known as diplomatic cover, in where they have offices at the various embassies around the world. And this follows on from 1948, the year after the CIA was created, with a secret agreement for many years between the State Department and the CIA, which permitted the CIA to have slots, as they were known, or positions undercover inside the diplomatic service, people working for the State Department as legitimate diplomats. These people were not legitimate diplomats. They're working under various forms of cover as economic officers, as political officers, as analysts, and so forth, under deep cover, under diplomatic cover. There is also a category, as I just mentioned, deep cover, people who do not work in the embassies. They never actually even are allowed to go near the embassy. They are called deep cover people. And we once got hold of a document which was the manual of the CIA, a training manual for people under deep cover. And what they do sometimes for years is pretend to be all manner of people, whether tourists or whether religious people, as missionaries or as academics of one kind or another. It's a very difficult and dangerous job and very demanding job because they have to work a day job, which is that job they're trying to pretend is what they do as a day job, and then at night, for the most part, their job is to carry on deep cover activities for the CIA. And so that manual created some waves when we published it. It's kind of boring to read, and yet actually it's a very valuable insight to how the CIA is constructed. Then we did more and more research on and articles about the whole range of CIA activities, whether it's in Africa, in Southern Africa, certainly in Angola and Mozambique and South Africa. For years, the U.S. pretended that it was opposed to apartheid in South Africa, when in fact the CIA, on one hand, and the Congress was secretly supporting apartheid and violating the laws that prevented trading with South Africa, and its secret exports to the apartheid regime. And then we wrote about the Caribbean. We wrote a lot about Cuba, and CIA, many, dozens of years of operations against Cuba, including over 700 attempts on the life of Fidel Castro. Mm. That's documented, and not one of them succeeded. He did end up dying a natural death, but he did not die from the efforts by the CIA to either plant a poison diving suit on him, because they used to love to go underwater and look at the coral, and or an exploding cigar that they tried to put on him, and so forth and so on. We wrote about Grenada, the U.S. invasion of Grenada. I actually had occasion to visit Grenada before the assassination of Maurice Bishop, who was an extraordinary man. Actually, Ellen and Bill introduced me to Maurice Bishop, and no less at the UN, because he used to. His education was first at Howard University here in Washington, and so when he came to the UN as the Prime Minister, and he was received by a massive crowd in New York and Brooklyn, as well as at the UN. He was applauded there. But before he got up to speak, he invited us into his hotel room, and he's still standing there in his jockey shorts, and he says, "Oh, what's going on here?" And we were talking about efforts to destabilize Grenada, which was already well advanced. And finally, his colleague came in and said, "Maurice, come on, you got to give a talk to the UN in a half an hour. Get ready." And so it was an amazing experience. But in the end, Maurice Bishop was set up by a so-called self-described scientific socialist who then ended up being involved in a plan to assassinate him. And in fact, that's what happened. He and his entire cabinet, it was 7 people, including the Minister of Education, Jacqueline Kreft, and Bishop, and the 5 others were stripped naked and lined up against the wall and mowed down by machine guns. So that's another expression of how the CIA operates. We wrote also a lot about Western Europe, about CIA operations in Europe, and where Phil Agee had lived for a number of years, including in the UK, including in Germany. In fact, he was driven out of 6 different Western European countries by the CIA. And he's only the second person to have his U.S. passport seized by the United States. The first and only other person was the great Paul Robeson. And so they took Phil's passport, and claiming that he was a subversive and he was going all over the world, which he was, giving lectures about the CIA. And that's where I first met him in the UK and in Amsterdam. And I'll never forget, both in Amsterdam and in Germany, the heavy blanket of surveillance on Phil and his family and myself while we were there. In fact, we uncovered a document which proved that the CIA was plotting to kill Phil. The only reason they didn't was because they decided, according to the document, that the finger would point right back at them.
Sure.
And so it's not for lack of wanting to kill him, but they ended up letting him live.
Hmm.
And let's see, we wrote about COINTELPRO, the FBI's operations, massive operations against the left and the black movement here in the United States. It's a strange irony, a very chilling irony, that the FBI has now refounded something called the Black Extremist Movement, and so now it's a very similar, in fact, almost identical to COINTELPRO, except it's aimed again at people of color who are struggling against police killings across the board in this country of black people, and then there has something's come up called the Blue Lives Matter movement, which is the police and the police union and others saying, well, blue lives matter more than black lives. Effectively, that's what they're saying.
Right.
So the gun culture is very active in this country, as we know, the NRA and its allies. We hope to analyze further the role of the NRA's support from the U.S. government, not least of which by the intelligence agencies.
Well, it is fascinating when you go back and look at your magazine. A lot of the issues, the great majority of the issues that are appeared in your magazine are still issues that we're dealing with today, whether there's environment and some climate change, whether it is things like U.S. interventions around the world, whether it's things like mass surveillance or domestic repression, that the tactics may have changed, but all those issues are the same. So that's why I'm so excited to see your magazine come back, because you all have a 40-year history of knowing about these same things, and you've seen them over the years. So that's why I'm really excited, and I hope that everybody gets a chance to look.
I thank you, Dave, for those words, and I know you're very sincere and mean them. I forgot to mention what you were alluding to earlier was the law that they ended up writing to prevent, and they, in this case, was the CIA. They acknowledged when we were identifying CIA personnel wholly from public sources, not a single classified document, but from public sources, particularly the State Department Biographic Register, which was published since 1878 until the early part of the decade when they made it classified. And even though my understanding it's not highly classified, it's just official use only, which is the lowest level of classification, but it is a classified document. That is where you find the biographies of real State Department people, and then mixed in that document and that volume, which is several hundred pages, are the biographies of CIA personnel under diplomatic cover. And so we developed a methodology, a very scientific methodology, to winnow out the CIA people from these legitimate State Department biographies. And then we had a column in the magazine called Naming Names. And let me stress here that it was not because we wanted to see them killed. Hardly. In fact, we took the position that a CIA person being assassinated is going to win them friends, except for maybe from the people who suffer under their covert activities. Well, one of them was assassinated. Richard Welch was the CIA station chief in Athens. And he had been warned before moving to Athens. Actually, his predecessor was being tailed and closely, even sitting behind him in the movie theater, in the row right behind him. So they knew who he was. This was a Greek underground guerrilla group. And so they were planning to assassinate him. And then the next week, suddenly he was gone and had been transferred to Canada, as chief of station there. And there was Richard Welch. So Welch and his wife had said, we want to move into this house, which was well known as the station chief's house. How well known? Well, all the tourist buses used to be driven by the house, and the driver would point over to, that's the house of the head of the CIA here. That's how well known it was known. And then he was assassinated. But we wrote the full story. The official story about his death was that he had been set up by us and by Philip Agee, when in fact he had been named no less than 5 times before his assassination, being in Peru and one time and another time in Europe, and before then finally he was assassinated. But he was allied very, very closely with the military dictatorship, very brutal dictatorship in the generals in the 70s in Greece, actively supported by the CIA. So it was not like he was blameless, and that's the man who was assassinated. We never tried to claim that he should have been assassinated. No, but the fact is that it happened because he decided he wanted to live in his house. Come hell or high water, I'm going to stay there, and my wife likes the curtains and so forth and so on. And it was, like a couple of blocks from the embassy, and you can imagine the choice that he made there.
Right. Well, that's sounds like hubris.
And then later, I should add here, the Congress, they wrote a law which was called the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, and which outlawed anybody, any journalist, anybody identifying any CIA or personnel, whether it's from public sources or secret documents or anything else. And this was a bill of attainder, actually aimed at yours truly, because I was doing the research, and I would sit in the Library of Congress and the National Archives doing methodical research, very precise, not guesswork, nothing like that. It was the real. We actually eliminated some dozens of people from our column because we weren't absolutely sure that they were CIA. And so they wrote this law, and that's what it became law, which is still law today.
Why don't we start to talk about some of the things that have passed since you all stopped publication? Do you want to talk about some of the events that have happened today? Like, I guess you all stopped publication in 2005. The United States was in the middle of the Iraq occupation, and at that point it was turning into a complete civil war. Do you want
really a war without end, not just a civil war? I mean, this is what the U.S. does. It's now literally war without end. That's the objective, and that is what's going on before our very eyes.
Right, and spreading into other countries.
That's correct.
Well, so what is you? I guess you want to talk a little bit about what you made of the Obama administration's foreign policy, maybe what the Arab Spring meant, and some of his other policies, such as what happened in the Ukraine and things like that?
Well, sure. There came about during the Obama administration. They were called color revolutions, and I have to point out that the Obama administration, we have to call him out on what he did. He set the tone for what we're watching now, in terms of he and his administration, not just he alone, for massive violence, use of drones, the use of highly technological means of war, including, I would add here, biological war and chemical war, as well as drones and the Air Force bombing and so forth. And let's not forget that the U.S. overthrew Gaddafi, and in that case, and now it's being talked about quite openly as the model for bringing down Kim Jong-un in North Korea, as if that's a model. That is how that Gaddafi first was his government was in Libya was destabilized through all manner of operations, economic warfare, and denial of food and medicine, and finally there was it wasn't a popular revolution. It was use of CIA and Pentagon paid guerrillas on the streets, and they ended up capturing him and beating him to death. And in fact, if you go back and see the video of it, he was actually disemboweled on film. You can see it, watch it happen. Mm-hmm. So, and then for Donald Trump and for what's his name now? His national security advisor.
Oh, Bolton.
John Bolton, who's literally like a caveman in official positions such as the national security advisor. His policies are really, truly bizarre, and they're gaining credence thanks to him. I mean, he, by the way, Bolton is there without any Senate confirmation. He's put in place, and just like the king of this country now, he thinks he's royalty, and he can do what he wants. So let's be clear here that the United States is no longer, if it really ever was in recent history, a democracy. It is really becoming a dictatorship. And if you analyze the definitions of fascism, I would say that we are moving headlong towards fascism. We're not quite there yet, but I do believe that's where it's headed. And whatever happens with this administration, I'm not very confident of the impeachment option, because I think, what do we get then? We get Mike Pence, who's even more ominous and more dangerous than Trump. But the very fact that one of his best friends is Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, who's engaged in a massive killing operation under the guise of fighting drugs. Well, Trump met with him in Manila and then also in the White House, and they were big pals there. So it's no surprise that this is the kind of people that he cultivates and that he gets along with. But you cannot believe a single word that comes out of the man's mouth. I mean, he changes from day to day. Certainly in the case of North Korea, he's done it just in the past 3 or 4 days. He does it vis-a-vis Mexico, the border, wanting to build the wall. Everywhere you turn, U.S. policy, which, by the way, is without him naming ambassadors or undersecretaries of state. The rudimentary requirements for government is that you have people in place in different positions, and there are dozens of countries where there is either no ambassador been named. Several of his nominees for ambassadors were rejected by the Senate, and yet he plows forward, thinking that he can live by fiat, he can rule by fiat, and that he can rule by dictating and tweeting every other hour almost, including in the middle of the night. I don't know what he does in his bed, but I can only guess. But the point is that the man rules in a bizarre way. Let's be clear, and he has an approval rating. Why did people vote for him? Particularly women, after hearing what he said on that bus. So how is it that he was allowed into the White House? I would say that, and it's a long story, but I think it's partly to blame. Part of the blame falls on the Democratic Party. We have one party with two names, and they're almost mirror images of each other. Maybe some differences, yes, but not very real. And so the pretense of democracy in this country is fading fast.
What do you see is coming up that looks very important and that you're planning to cover in the next, say, 6 months?
Certainly high among them is torture. Torture has become a cornerstone of U.S. policy, very publicly so. It's still going on, even if there are public statements saying we don't do that anymore, and I'm using their quotes. We don't do that anymore. Well, all you have to do is go to the record and see what they were capable of doing, and a lot of it is still going on inside of the whole range of CIA bases and so-called black sites. How racist is that alone? Gina Haspel, who is now the Director of Central Intelligence, was proud to say at her confirmation hearing, when they asked her, is torture immoral? And she kind of stammered and finally said, I believe in law, and whatever the U.S. does, it's lawful. Well, that was thanks to Bush-era lawyers who fashioned into legal language similar to Adolf Hitler. So a lot of what Hitler did was also legal. And so we intend to follow through on this kind of work and revelation as best we can. We have a number of people who know a lot about the historical role that torture has played in CIA operations in the world. There is a military code, and supposedly of interrogations. That code, at least, is somewhere this side of being still civilized. But Gina Haspel, I believe, is going to take this country, now that she's confirmed, by only 6 votes. That's hardly a ringing endorsement of her candidacy. It took 6 Democrats to vote for her to enable her to be confirmed. So thank you, Democratic Party, for that.
All right.
So that'll be a lot of what we're going to do. We're also very clear that her confirmation hearing was nothing short of a psychological operation, because if you read in the mainstream media the day before, in the Washington Post and other places, that she was actively coached by CIA personnel on what to say, how to answer questions, and so forth. And you could see it. And then on a couple occasions, they were whispering in her ear during the hearing. So under official law, it's prohibited for the CIA to carry out propaganda in the United States. A friend of mine just pointed out a talk I gave this week that there was an act called the Smith-Mundt Act. Carl Mundt, M-U-N-D-T, was a senator in 1946, and he and another senator fashioned a law which prohibited propaganda by the U.S. government in the United States. Well, it's no surprise to say that there's been propaganda forever in this country, but Now, when you watch that hearing of Gina Haspel, it was propaganda. It was a whole very skillful and very classy. I shouldn't say classy. Very the opposite of classy. Psychological operation.
Mm-hmm.
We will also make sure that we continue to focus on having writers from the Global South who will write about the impacts of our U.S. policy. Let me just remind your listeners that every president in our lifetimes has said the magic words, quote, "The United States is the greatest nation on the face of the earth," unquote. That is what is popularly known as exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. Obama himself was proud to say, "We are exceptional," his words. Well, that kind of leaves out all the 196 other countries in the world. If you say we're exceptional, we are the greatest nation on the face of the earth. So we will be writing and reporting a lot about exceptionalism and what it really translates to in the daily lives of people around this globe. And that's what we feel is our duty, to come down very clearly on this issue.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well, so let me. Is there anything else you want to add before we go? I do want to add. You and Chris, and I don't know anybody else. Are you going to be at Left Forum next weekend?
Yes, we're going to have a panel there, and we invite people in New York to come. It's at the the school.
Oh yeah, no, it's at John Jay.
John Jay College of Criminal History, yeah, which is on its own one of the great institutions of learning. I've given talks there in the past, and it's very impressive what they are trying to do with their student body and their faculty. So it's on Saturday, Saturday, June 2nd, starting at 2:00. I don't know the room number, but it's easily, you could check it on the Left Forum website.
Sure, I'll put a link on. I'll put a little link on.
Thank you.
On here, but yeah, so that'll be exciting. And what do you guys? You're going to talk about the relaunch of the magazine, or?
Yeah, well, relaunching the magazine. What our vision is, in which is now we've already done relaunched the magazine, and as well have several of our board members, 2 or 3 of our board members will be speaking there. And then we're going to open up to questions and discussion, because that's really the best part of it. We will also have a table there where we'll have full sets of the magazine available for purchase there. And one of our speakers, I should not fail to mention, is the great William Blum, B-L-U-M,
oh, wow.
who is the foremost historian on the CIA. He wrote several books, including Killing Hope, and the other one is called Rogue State. Well, which rogue state is he writing about? The United States is the rogue state. And so he's going to give a talk. But we only have an hour and 50 minutes, so we have to do it, each be concise, and then we want to allow maximum time for us to share views on this and discussion, questions and discussion.
No, that sounds fantastic. People should be really excited for that, and if they're going to Left Forum, should definitely put that on their schedule of things to check out.
And they can also visit our website, which is Covert Action Magazine, all one word, .com. And then you can look up our history, you can look up who we are, our board of advisors and editors. And if anybody out there is interested in a job, we're looking for a marquee editor, somebody who would want to be our editor. Please let us know. There's a way to reach us through the website, or you can send me an email, and my email is LOUW7, the number 7, LOUW7 @live.com.
Great. And you guys, I also want to mention, you guys also have a For people who are on Twitter, you guys have a Twitter account at Covert Action Mag, MAG, at Covert Action Mag on Twitter. And yeah, no, it's there's a lot there, and the website is great. There's already, there's tons to read and look at, so it's well worth a visit.
I have to admit to you, Dave, that Twitter and Facebook are not only over my head, but I have chosen, particularly in the case of Facebook, to stay away from Facebook now that we know a whole lot more about it and what it represents and how it was used expressly used with connivance with the U.S. intelligence apparatus to spread people's private information all over the world. And let me just lastly point out who created Facebook. It's a company called In-Q-Tel, IN-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is, and you can check this any way you want, In-Q-Tel is a wholly owned CIA proprietary, which is a company which is conceived to make money for the CIA, but it's also a perfect platform. Facebook is for, people hand on the silver platter everything personal and very private right over to them or anyone who wants to know. So I don't use Facebook, but
right. No,
it does. Yeah, that's where it's at.
It's an intelligence agency's dream, really. I think that's probably one of the biggest changes since you guys had ceased publishing was the rise of the internet and all of this kind of thing. So
there was no such thing when we started.
Oh, definitely.
Even computers didn't hardly exist.
Was it so where did you, just not to go back and go too far back in time, but how did you guys, where was your magazine sold? Was it in kind of alternative bookstores and on newsstands all over, or?
That's right, yes. We tried to put it out anywhere and everywhere we could in alternative bookstores, but also in mainstream bookstores. There was a bookstore on K Street here in Washington, D.C., and it was his largest selling magazine. He always put it in the front window. And he sold out every issue. We had to resupply him. And then one of the bookstores here in Washington, they told me once that every time the new magazine came out, this guy in beautiful silk suit used to walk in and buy every issue of it. And why was that? And he was clearly intelligence operative, and so they could take him home, take him back to the CIA, and then we resupplied. In fact, they sent us a check once to subscribe. So what do? We printed the check right on the front page. And, so I will admit to people, we did take $17 once from the CIA. Yes.
Oh, that's great. Well, they did, when the CIA finally put their CREST archive online, I know that there was, that was maybe 12 issues that they had tucked away in there, in 12 full issues that people had found in there. Yeah. So that's something.
That's the truth. It's an ugly truth, but it is the truth.
Definitely. Well, great, Lou. I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk, and
thank you.
I really look forward to seeing what you guys do, and yeah, I urge everybody to go check out the website and support your project, and I think a lot of really good can come out of this. So thank you very much, Lou.
Thanks a lot.
This is Our Hidden History